You know, this is my video lecture in legal aspects in the hospitality and tourism industry. No, but before I proceed with my video lecture for today, I'd like to announce that your midterm examination will be this Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the morning until 12 noon time. No, it's August 17, Wednesday, from 10 a.m. to 12 noon time. No, so I repeat, your midterm examination will be this Wednesday, August 17, from 10 a.m. up to 12 noon time. No, and then your final examination will be on Monday, August 22, from 2 to 4 p.m. No, so your final examination will be on Monday, August 22, 2022, from 2 to 4 p.m. Now, I repeat, the coverage of the midterm examination this Wednesday will be until what will be taken today, from the time we started up to the video lecture for today, and also the video lectures that you have had during the last semester, no, that second semester, no. So in short, the coverage will be a little bit comprehensive. The video lectures that I have had in the past, no, meaning when you first took this course, up to the lectures that I will be having today, no. Also on Monday, these are my instructions, no. Also on Monday, which will be your final examination, you have to submit your portfolio, no, because that is also one of the basis in giving you your grade. Now on Monday, which will be your final examination, it will be an in-person examination, meaning you have to come and take the final examination in person, no, and you just have to look for Miss Andrea in the office, and she will be assisting you on what to do. Okay, so again, another announcement is that today until Friday there will be a video lecture daily, no. So from August 15, rather, from August 15 up to August 19, there will be a video lecture which I will be giving you on a daily basis, no. So today, let us take it. Today is August 15, no, and our topic will be on obligations and contracts, no, obligations and contracts, because you know this is an important subject or topic which you will be dealing with later on when you become a tourism professional, no. Although this subject is most this subject is usually given to what? To business students, no, business students, because we believe that what? Business students, because we believe that they will be encountering certain issues or problems relating to obligations as well as contracts. So today, I will be discussing the principles, no, we will just be having the principles today on obligations. Then tomorrow, I will be discussing also contracts, no. But of course, for lack of material time, we'll just be dealing with this topic briefly, no, meaning it will just be the principles, not the examples that I will be giving you, because anyhow, you have all the time to research on and be acquainted with the different principles on obligations and contracts. So I will begin now my discussion on obligations. Now, the particular provisions, no, actually, when we talk of obligations, you could find the legal basis, no, the legal basis, meaning where you could find the provisions, no, provisions relating to obligations. You can find that in the New Civil Code. No? Civil Code. We call that the NCC. No? It's a thick book. No? The new Civil Code is where you could find, if you would like to know more about the topic on obligations, the legal basis, you could find that in the new Civil Code. This is where you could see the specific legal provisions relating to obligations. And of course, the first thing that we have to do is, of course, we have to define what an obligation is, and that you could find that in Article 1156 of the NCC. When I talk about NCC, that's the new Civil Code. No? When you see that, it's the new Civil Code. Now, when we talk of an obligation, we are referring to a juridical necessity. No? What do you understand by a juridical necessity? No? What do you understand by this term? It's a juridical necessity to what? Juridical meaning there is a tie or a bond, no, that is being created. No, juridical meaning there is a bond or a tie that is being created, and that tie or bond is what we call the what? The cause of the obligation. Later on we will be dealing with this a little bit more, but I'd like you to envision that an obligation is a juridical necessity. Juridical necessity to what? Well, to give. It's a juridical necessity whereby one binds himself to the other to give, to do, and then not to do. No? So these are what we call prestations. No? Prestations of the obligation. No? It's not presentation but prestation. Prestation meaning, what do you mean by prestation? Payment. No? Payment of something. Huh? So I'd like you to remember that an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, juridical necessity whereby one binds himself with the other, because of course there are parties to an obligation, right? Whereby one binds himself to the other to give, to do, or not to do. No? And these are what we call prestations. No? Do not say presentations because that is wrong. Prestations would mean payment. Okay? So let us take this one by one. Juridical necessity to give. No? Juridical necessity to give. So what is that obligation to give? Miss Johnny, what is that obligation to give? Well, when we say this is a prestation to give, we are referring to what are you going to give? The other term for to give is to deliver. What are you going to deliver? Of course, Miss Johnny. Well, it may be a thing, no? Whether movable or immovable, a right. Yeah? To give a thing or a right. No? And when we talk of an obligation to give, we say to deliver. Of course, a thing, the thing itself, no? If it is a right, well, of course, the evidence of that right, you have to give that. Okay? Clear? So when we talk of the obligation to give, we are talking about the obligation to deliver something. And that something, it could either be a thing or a right. Here, Miss Johnny, this is the first prestation. The second prestation that I'm talking about is the obligation to do. No? To do. Of course, this is another prestation. No? To do. Another prestation. Which means what, Miss Johnny? When we talk of the obligation to do, when we talk about this, we are talking about to render what? Service. Clear? To render a service. And what kind of service is that? Well, it depends, no? If you want if you have commissioned a painter, for instance, he has to deliver the painting, no? Which, of course, he has done in the form of his service. If what you would like to commission is a singer, of course, he has to sing, no? In the party where you have contracted with her, no? To do. And then, of course, the third prestation is what we call the obligation not to do. Not to do. No, this is negative, which means it's a prohibition. No, you cannot do that because that is your obligation. You cannot do that. Say, for instance, you cannot build a house on, say, for instance, a 10-story house. For instance, 10-story house. You cannot do that because of there is a prohibition, say, for instance, in the community, as this place is purely residential. And if it is residential, of course, the concept of a house will not be a 10-story building. No? Okay? So again, I repeat, under 1156, what is an obligation? An obligation is a juridical necessity to, I repeat, to do. Other term for to deliver, to give first, of course, to give something or to deliver, to do. And the third prestation is not to do, or it's a prohibition. It's a prohibition. You cannot do it because it is not allowed. Okay, so we move on. Now, of course, there are different types of obligations according to judicial enforceability. No, types. We talk about the types of obligations from the aspect of judicial enforceability. No, enforceability, and we have three of this. No, when we talk of judicial enforceability, you could file a case in court, a civil case in court, and demand. What are you going to demand? Well, you could demand payment or fulfillment of the obligation. So in short, this is actionable in court. You could either demand payment, you could demand fulfillment in case the debtor fails to comply with this obligation. And before I forget, no, of course, in an obligation there are what we call mga artista, no? What we call the contracting parties, diba? We call those the contracting parties. These are the parties to an obligation. Clear, Johnny? And that we call the contracting parties. There are only two, no? We have the creditor and we have the debtor. No? So these are the contracting parties. Now the creditor is otherwise known as the obligee. No? And the debtor is what we call the obligor. No? These are terms, legal terms which you should know, because usually these are also used in contracts. No? So when we talk of the obligor, we are talking about the debtor. When we talk about the obligee, we are talking about the creditor. And here, these parties, who will do or who has the right to demand fulfillment or payment of the obligation? Who do you think is the active party? Is it the creditor or the debtor? Who has the right to demand fulfillment or payment? It's the creditor. No? So he is considered as the active subject. No? Active subject matter. And the debtor is the one who is what we consider as the passive subject or contracting party. we will talk about this later on. But I'd like to impress upon you, Miss Johnny, that in an obligation there are two parties, di ba? I have defined what an obligation is. I told you earlier that an obligation is a juridical necessity whereby one party, meaning one party, sino yung one party, one party binds himself with respect to the other, no? Binds himself with respect to the other. Who binds himself? This one, the debtor, binds himself with the creditor to fulfill or to pay a certain obligation. Okay, so remember these two parties in an obligation. I'd like you to remember. Now we have to proceed now with the different types of obligations according to judicial, from the perspective of judicial enforceability. Meaning, when we talk of judicial enforceability, you could go to court and demand for the fulfillment of the obligation according to judicial enforceability. And we have what we call, the first type of the obligation is what we call the civil obligation. Civil obligation. This one you can enforce in court. No? Civil obligations. One that you could enforce in court. And usually, the ones that will fall under civil obligations will be covered by what we call a contract. No? If there is a contract, there is evidence, and if there is evidence, of course, you could enforce that in court. Okay, next type would be what we call natural obligations. No? Natural obligations. Now, for natural obligations, can you enforce this in court? Can you enforce this, or can you bring this to court? The answer is no. No? Cannot be enforced in court. Cannot be enforced in court because of what? A certain lapse. No? You could not enforce that. Natural obligations, you cannot enforce that. Why is this? Why can you not enforce? Well, because you have no proof at all, and the only proof that you've got is perhaps a document that has already lapsed or that has already prescribed. No? That has already prescribed. Now, for natural obligations, just think of this way. No? If you could not understand natural obligations, the principle here is what we call no one can unjustly enrich himself at the expense of another. At the expense of another. Perhaps I will give this as an example. No? Remember that no one in his right mind could unjustly enrich, no? Magpayaman siya at the expense of another. Say for instance, as an example of a natural obligation is when, say for instance, you executed a promissory note, no? PN. PN would be a promissory note. No? Because you contracted a loan with somebody. No? You contracted a loan with somebody. So you executed a promissory note, and this promissory note has a life of, say for instance, 6 months only. So if you executed today, say for instance August 15, you count 6 months. No, the validity of the promissory note would be August, September, October, November, December, January, February 15, 2023. No, so you executed a promissory note because you have taken a loan. No, say for instance a loan of 10,000 pesos with Maria, for instance. So you contracted a loan for 10,000 pesos, and of course, as your promise to pay your loan, you executed what we call a promissory note. No, and you executed that the validity of this promissory note is 6 months. this will become due on February 15, 2023. But the problem is you were not able to pay your loan. So this one, 6 months after, you were not able to pay, no? So in short, the validity of the promissory note has already elapsed, no? Tapos na siya. Wala na. So supposed to be, you should have paid on or before February 15, 2023. Now, as circumstances in your favor would improve in years to come, say for instance, 5 years later, you know that you have this utang to Maria in the amount of 10,000 pesos, right? 5 years later, your finances improve, no? And you thought of your loan of 10,000 pesos and the promissory note that you have executed in favor of Maria, no? Remember that you have now the money, no? 5 years after. But the promissory note has already lapsed because you were not able to pay it on or before February 15, 2023. Now, are you duty bound? No? It's a natural obligation because you have that. No? You know very well that you executed this promissory note. You know very well that you have a loan of 10,000 pesos with Maria. Now, you are not being forced. No? It's up to you already to pay Maria and pay the promissory note that you have executed so that you will not be unjustly enriching yourself at the expense of another. So that is an example of what we call a natural obligation. No? Cannot be enforced in court. Cannot be enforced in court, but you have the the obligation. No? You have the obligation to pay so that you will not unjustly enrich yourself at the expense of another. So that you will not unjustly enrich yourself. Unjustly enrich yourself at the expense of another. Okay? So this is the second type of obligation according to judicial enforceability. And the third one is, of course, what we call moral obligation. No? Moral obligation. Well, of course, when we talk of moral obligation, we talk of something that is ethical. And where do we find this? Of course, ethical would mean what is right and what is wrong. And where do you find this? Well, of course, in ethical would pertain to our church. No, there are rules on the church. There are rules as to our faith or religious denomination. Moral, it's your moral obligation. Say for instance, how about if you're a Catholic and of course there is a death penalty that is being proposed. Will you allow this? No? So of course you could also give your views as to you are morally bound to oppose the death penalty. Or say for instance same-sex marriage, no, which is never allowed. Same-sex marriage, no. So you could also cite your views and say something about this. You are morally bound. You have the obligation to speak of something which is or which will run counter to the beliefs of your church or to the beliefs and principles that you are embracing, no? Okay, so in an obligation, okay, we proceed. You already know the types of different types of obligations. Again, we are moving so fast, no? In an obligation, there are essential requisites, no? Essential, we call them essential elements. And of course, there are 4 essential elements of an obligation. The first is, I have already mentioned to you, the active subject. Who is the active subject again? Miss Choni? The one who has the right to demand the fulfillment or payment of the obligation is the, who is the active subject? It is the creditor, or what we call the obligee. No? And now, who is the passive subject? No? Who is the passive subject? The one, this one, the active subject, the creditor or obligee, it is, he is the one to whom the obligation was constituted in his favor. No? Siya yung may right to demand the fulfillment of an obligation. This one, the passive subject, will be the debtor, or what we call the obligor. He is the one who has to fulfill the obligation or pay the obligation. No? So this is the second element, no? The passive subject. The third is, of course, you already know, no? Prestation. The prestation is, of course, the subject matter, no? Subject matter of the obligation. And of course, the fourth one would be the cost, or efficient cost, that we call efficient cost of the obligation. What is the efficient cost? Well, this is the juridical tie. No? This is the juridical tie. Or when we talk of the efficient cost, we are talking of the vinculum. No? Vinculum of the obligation. The cost, why the obligation was entered into. No? So when we talk of the cost, efficient cost, the why the obligation was entered into. And we call that the vinculum, or the juridical tie. So these are the essential elements. Now when we talk of the essential elements, the absence of one will invalidate or make the obligation void, because these are essential, remember, essential requisites or essential elements of an obligation. So what else? Of course, we talk about the sources. No? How come that obligations arise? No? What are the sources? Where, sino, or saan, paano nakikreate ang obligasyon, the obligations? No? Could you name one, Ms. Johnny? How come that there are obligations? Huh? Ms. Johnny? So, sources. We talk now of the sources of obligations. No? So, one, there are obligations arising from the law. No? So, you are creating an obligation based on a certain provision of a law. Say for instance, what is that obligation? Well, of course, another example would be the payment of taxes. No, there is a law, payment of taxes. So this is one obligation that arises from law. No, a created obligation based on a specific provision of law. What else? What other examples? Well, of course, your obligation to take care of your children, obligation to take care of your children. And of course, you could find these provisions under the family code. No? Under the family code. No? So you have those. You have that obligation that is based on a law. No? So that is one. The second is obligations arising from what? Miss Johnny? Arising from contracts. No? Well, if you entered into obligations arising from contracts, no? Of course, this one will really create an obligation, diba? Because if you entered into a contract, there are certain rights that are created. There are also certain duties that are created, or responsibilities that are created, and there are obligations that are also created in case you enter into a contract with somebody. Anyway, we will be discussing contracts tomorrow. No? Okay, so this is number 2, obligations arising from contracts. No, the third will be obligations arising from what we call quasi contracts. No, quasi contracts. And what are quasi contracts? Well, very similar to natural obligations. No, what is the principle of natural obligations again? No one can unjustly enrich himself at the expense of another. No, quasi contracts, because you see the expense of another, because as you see, just like what I have given you as an example, there was, say for instance, you executed a promissory note, and this promissory note has elapsed already, meaning it has been invalidated by the lapse of time, but still, because there was this previously, you are duty bound to pay this, no? Even if it has already elapsed in its validity. Why? Because of course you cannot enrich yourself at the expense of another. Now, this is the third, I believe. So we go now to the fourth source of obligation, and the fourth source would be obligations arising from delicts. No? What are delicts? These are crimes. No? Crimes. No? There are specific provisions also of the law, and the crimes, if you violate something, could be found in the revised penal code. No? Of course, when you killed somebody, you have the obligation to indemnify somebody. No? If you were able to, say for instance, kill someone, you ought to indemnify somebody, no? Because of that crime. And this one, you could find the specific provisions in the revised penal code. So an obligation will also arise, say for instance, what? You were able to kill someone, no? And that is a crime. Diba? That is a crime. You were able to kill someone. So of course, you have to indemnify somebody. Indemnify somebody. Or another example, say for instance, estafa. No? This is also a crime punishable by the revised penal code. Say for instance, estafa. No, estafa na nag-ispalgo ka ng something, ng money. Of course, you have to indemnify somebody. Indemnify somebody for what you have taken. Nang ispalgo ka, no? Plus, of course, damages. And this is also one way by which an obligation is created based on delicts, or what we call crimes. Okay? And then finally, the fifth one is obligations arising from wayside delicts. Wayside delicts. And what are quasi delicts? They are called torts, no? And quasi delicts, when they are like crimes, no? Because what happens here is there is negligence, there is fault, there is omission, no? You have done something, and by virtue of this negligence, fault, or omission, you were able to cause harm to somebody. Cause harm to somebody. And of course, because you were able to cause harm to somebody, no, you have to indemnify also that person or whoever you have caused harm to anyone, no? And of course, that will be in the form also of damages. So these are the different sources of obligations. Okay? Learning. So we will continue tomorrow on contracts. No, I told you Every day we'll be having a video lecture starting today up to Friday. And then we have your midterm examination this Wednesday from 10 to 12 o'clock noon time. Okay, good afternoon.